Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. What would you do if your HOA painted HOA use only, no parking, across your driveway overnight, on land you legally own? I didn't argue. I went full project manager, photos, measurements, and one email. Then the HOA president hit reply all and handed me exactly what I needed. Can you guess what it was? I'm a project manager by trade, which means I'm naturally detail-oriented and methodical. Some people call it obsessive, but it served me well over the years. When I bought my first house 3 years ago in this planned community, I was so proud. It's a corner lot with an oversized driveway that was perfect for my woodworking hobby. I've got my workshop set up in the garage, and that extra driveway space means I can actually get lumber deliveries and work on bigger projects without blocking anyone. The HOA here is run by a board of 5 people, but really it's dominated by the president who lives just a few houses down from me. She's a retiree who seems to have made managing everyone else's business her full-time job. Over the past 3 years, I've had my share of run-ins with her, though nothing major. There was the time I got a notice because my recycling bin was still visible from the street 2 hours after pickup. Another time, I got a warning that the purple petunias I planted were not on the approved color palette for our section. I always just rolled my eyes and complied. I'm not looking for fights with neighbors. But last Saturday morning changed everything. I woke up excited for the weekend. I had planned to work on a new bookshelf project and maybe wash my car. I grabbed my coffee and headed outside to open the garage door and start my day. That's when I stopped dead in my tracks. There, gleaming in the morning sun, was a bright yellow line painted across my driveway. Not just any line, but a sharp, professional-looking stripe that cut off a 3-foot-wide strip along the entire edge of my driveway where it borders the common grass area. The paint was so fresh I could smell the fumes. But what really got me was the black stenciled lettering next to the line that read HOA use only, no parking. My first thought was to find the nearest can of paint thinner and scrub this insult off my property. But then the project manager in me kicked in. My second thought was much better. Document everything. I went back inside and grabbed my phone. For the next 20 minutes, I took photos from every angle. Wide shots showing the line in relation to my house and the property boundaries. Close-ups of the stenciled letters. I even recorded a video walking the entire length of the line, narrating the date and time, pointing out that this was done without any notice or permission. I placed my tape measure on the ground to show exactly how much of my driveway they had claimed. The whole time I was documenting, my mind was racing. This wasn't some mistake or miscommunication. Someone had paid for professional painters to come out here and mark off part of my property. The audacity was breathtaking. Once I had my evidence secured, I went to my home office and pulled out the folder from when I bought the house. Inside was my official plat map and property survey. I spread it out on my desk and used a ruler to check what I already knew in my heart. The entire concrete slab of my driveway was 100% within my property lines. The HOA's common area began at the edge of the grass, not 3 feet into my driveway. Now I had to decide how to handle this. I could have stormed over to the president's house and demanded answers. I could have called the management company and started yelling, but that's not how I operate. I opened my laptop and started drafting an email. I addressed it to the official HOA management company email and made sure to CC every board member's email address that I had saved from previous newsletters. The subject line read, "Unauthorized alteration of private property at my address." In the body, I kept it factual and professional. I explained that I had discovered the painted line that morning, that it was done without any notice to me, and that it was entirely on my private property according to my official survey. I didn't make accusations or threats. Instead, I put the burden of proof on them. The key sentence read, "Please provide a copy of the board meeting minutes authorizing this work on private property, the vendor work order, and the legal justification for this alteration. I have attached a copy of my official county-filed plat map for your reference." I attached high-resolution photos of the painted line and a PDF scan of my property survey, then hit send. It was 11:30 a.m. on Saturday. By 3:15 p.m., I had a response, not from the management company, but directly from the HOA president herself. She had hit reply all, so every board member would see her response. "Dear homeowner," it began, and I could practically hear the condescension dripping from those words. The board recently approved a project to clearly delineate common areas for maintenance access. That strip of driveway has long been used by our landscapers. This is simply formalizing the boundary. Please ensure your vehicle does not obstruct this HOA access lane going forward. She completely ignored my property survey. She provided none of the documents I had requested. And most importantly, she had just admitted in writing in front of the entire board that the HOA had authorized this work and was claiming ownership of part of my property. This was exactly what I was hoping for. I waited 3 hours before responding. I wanted her arrogance to hang in the air for the other board members to see. When I did reply, I was still polite but much firmer. Thank you for your response. However, you have failed to provide any documentation to support your claim, which is in direct contradiction to the legal plat map I provided. Your continued assertion that my private property is an HOA access lane is concerning. The act of entering my property and permanently altering it without my consent constitutes trespass and vandalism. I will ask one last time, please provide the name of the contractor who performed this work and a written plan for how and when you will have my property professionally restored to its original condition. I require this information within 48 hours. Then I waited. The 48 hours passed in complete silence. No response from the board, no call from the management company, nothing. It was clear they realized they had made a serious mistake and were hoping I would just drop it and move on. They were very wrong about that. Monday morning, I didn't send another email. Instead, I picked up the phone and called a real estate attorney whose name I found through my state bar association. I explained the situation and asked if he could spare an hour for a consultation. He agreed to see me that afternoon. The attorney's office was in a downtown high-rise, and his conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I spread out my photos, printed copies of the email chain, and my property survey across his mahogany table. As he reviewed everything, I watched his expression change from mild interest to genuine amusement to what I can only describe as professional excitement. He told me this was one of the most clear-cut cases of property trespass he had seen in years. The HOA had not only violated my property rights, but they had created permanent alterations without permission and then doubled down when confronted with legal evidence of their error. He said most of these cases involve gray areas and disputed boundaries, but this one was black and white. His consultation fee was $500, and he told me it would be money well spent. He offered to draft a cease and desist letter that would be sent via certified mail to both the management company and directly to the president's home address in her capacity as HOA president. I wrote the check on the spot. 2 days later, the attorney called to let me know the letter had been sent. He read me parts of it over the phone, and I have to admit, it was beautifully terrifying. The legal language was precise and unforgiving. Terms like willful trespass, property defacement, vandalism, and potential lien against HOA assets appeared throughout. The letter demanded 2 things within 72 hours. First, immediate professional removal of all paint and restoration of my driveway to its original condition, performed by a licensed and insured contractor at the HOA's sole expense. Second, full reimbursement for my legal fees in the amount of $500. If these demands were not met, the letter stated that I would file a lawsuit seeking damages including the cost of full driveway replacement, punitive damages for the board's willful negligence, and additional legal fees. The attorney also mentioned that since this was a clear case of trespass and property damage, the HOA's insurance might not even cover their legal costs because the actions were intentional rather than accidental. I didn't have to wait 72 hours for a response. Less than 24 hours after the certified letters were delivered, my phone rang. It wasn't the president calling, it was the HOA treasurer, and he sounded absolutely panicked. He told me there had been an emergency board meeting the night before. The other board members were furious when they learned the full scope of what had happened. Apparently, the president had authorized the painting without bringing it to a board vote, claiming it was just routine maintenance. She had never mentioned that it involved painting lines on private property. The treasurer apologized profusely and called the whole situation a terrible misunderstanding. He admitted the HOA was completely at fault, stated that the president had acted without proper verification, and promised they would make everything right immediately. I told him I appreciated his call, but that my attorney had laid out the terms clearly in his letter. The treasurer assured me that a professional paint removal crew would be at my house the next morning and that I would be fully compensated for my legal fees. True to his word, at 8 a.m. the following morning, a commercial truck pulled up in front of my house. It wasn't some handyman with a scraper and a bucket. This was a legitimate paint removal company with chemical strippers, pressure washers, and all the proper equipment. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and settled into my living room chair by the front window to watch the show. The crew worked for 4 hours, carefully removing every trace of yellow paint and black stenciling from my driveway. They used some kind of chemical treatment first, then high-pressure washing, and finally hand scrubbing to make sure no residue remained. The whole process was loud and involved, and I noticed several neighbors coming out to see what was happening. A few of them stopped to chat with the work crew, and I could see the workers explaining what they were doing. Word was definitely spreading through the neighborhood. When they finished, my driveway looked better than it had in months. They had basically given it a professional cleaning in the process of removing the paint. I went outside to inspect their work, and it was perfect. You would never know anything had been painted there. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with the HOA management company's return address. Inside was a check for exactly $500 and a formal letter of apology signed by 4 of the 5 board members. Notably absent was the president's signature. I drove straight to the bank and deposited the check. The fallout continued over the following weeks. Through neighborhood conversations, I learned that several other homeowners had started asking questions about the president's other beautification projects. Turns out this wasn't the first time she had overstepped her authority, just the first time someone had pushed back effectively. At the next annual HOA meeting 2 months later, the president did not run for re-election. Actually, that's not quite accurate. She tried to run, but when the nominations were open, not a single homeowner seconded her nomination. She sat there in embarrassed silence as her name was passed over. The new president is a retired accountant who runs meetings efficiently and doesn't seem interested in launching neighborhood improvement crusades. The HOA board meetings are now focused on actual maintenance issues and budget discussions, rather than policing paint colors and trash bin visibility. I occasionally see the former president when I'm out walking my dog or getting my mail. She never acknowledges me, and I'm perfectly fine with that arrangement. Her house went up for sale about 6 months after the incident. I heard through neighborhood chatter that she and her husband decided to move to a community with more like-minded residents. As for my driveway, it's never looked better. I've been able to expand my woodworking projects without worrying about HOA complaints. Last month I built a beautiful dining room table that required several large lumber deliveries, and I used every inch of that driveway space without a single comment from anyone. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with petty tyrants. For 3 years, I had been rolling my eyes and quietly complying with ridiculous rules, thinking it was easier to avoid conflict. But sometimes conflict finds you anyway. And when it does, having documentation and following proper procedures beats angry confrontation every time. The former president and her board thought they could draw a line to show their power. In the end, they did draw a line, but it was right under the cost of their own arrogance. They paid for the lawyer who held them accountable, funded the professional restoration of my property, and ultimately erased themselves from any position of authority. My driveway has never looked better, and our neighborhood has never been more peaceful. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting methodical. But there's more to the story that I haven't told yet about how this incident led to some other interesting developments in our community. About 2 weeks after the paint removal, I was out front loading lumber for another woodworking project when my neighbor from across the street walked over. He's a retired engineer who keeps to himself mostly, but he had a concerned look on his face. He told me he had been thinking about my situation and decided to dig out his own property survey from when he bought his house. Turns out, for the past year, the HOA landscaping crew had been dumping grass clippings and yard waste in a corner of his backyard that they claimed was common area. After seeing what happened to me, he checked his property lines and discovered that dumping site was actually 15 feet inside his property boundary. He asked if I could recommend my attorney. I gave him the contact information, and sure enough, a week later there was another certified letter situation. The HOA had to hire a removal service to haul away a year's worth of decomposing yard waste and pay for soil remediation where the grass clippings had killed his lawn. But that wasn't the end of it. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood about both incidents. People started pulling out their old closing documents and checking their property lines. What we discovered was that the former president had been using common area maintenance as an excuse to claim parts of private property all over the community. The family 2 streets over found out that the decorative boulder border the HOA had installed last summer was actually 3 feet onto their property. Another neighbor discovered that the new community mailbox cluster had been placed partially on his front lawn without permission. Someone else realized that the HOA's sprinkler system for the common areas was running water lines under their driveway without any easement agreement. Each discovery led to more attorney consultations, more certified letters, and more emergency board meetings. The HOA's insurance company got involved and was not happy about multiple property trespass claims. The management company started requiring detailed property surveys before approving any maintenance work. The financial impact on the HOA was substantial. They ended up paying for multiple attorney consultations, property restorations, soil remediation, and even had to relocate some infrastructure. The reserve fund that was supposed to last 5 years for community improvements was depleted in 6 months. But the most satisfying part was watching how the community dynamic changed. For years, homeowners had been intimidated by the president's aggressive enforcement of minor rules. People were afraid to plant the wrong color flowers or leave their garage door open too long. The atmosphere was tense and unwelcoming. After the property line incidents, residents started standing up for themselves. When someone got a notice about their mailbox being the wrong shade of black, 3 neighbors showed up at the next board meeting to question the rule. When a family was told their children's sidewalk chalk was a violation, a group of parents demanded to see the specific bylaw being cited. The new board president found himself spending most of his time defending legitimate rules and abandoning the petty ones that couldn't survive scrutiny. The community Facebook page, which had been dominated by compliance warnings and violation notices, started featuring actual neighborhood news and social events. I became something of an unofficial advisor for neighbors dealing with HOA issues. People would stop by while I was working in my garage to ask about documentation strategies or whether they should push back on certain notices. I always gave the same advice: keep everything in writing, know your property boundaries, and don't let anyone claim authority they don't actually have. One particularly memorable incident happened about 4 months after my driveway situation. A young couple had just moved into the neighborhood and received a violation notice because their front door was painted navy blue instead of the approved colonial blue. The difference was barely noticeable, but they were told they had 30 days to repaint or face fines. The husband came to ask my advice, and I suggested he request to see the official color standards and the specific rule being cited. When the HOA couldn't produce a written policy that clearly defined the acceptable colors, and when 3 other neighbors pointed out that their own doors were various shades of blue that had never been questioned, the violation notice was quietly withdrawn. The ripple effects continued throughout that first year. The HOA's annual budget meeting was unlike any in the community's history. Instead of just rubber stamping the board's proposals, homeowners showed up with questions about every line item. People wanted to know exactly what they were paying for and whether the expenses were legitimate. The former president's pet projects came under particular scrutiny. The community had been paying for monthly beautification assessments that funded things like seasonal flower displays in common areas. When residents discovered that much of this budget was actually being spent on landscaping around the president's own house under the guise of entrance enhancement, there was genuine outrage. The new treasurer, who had been elected after the previous one resigned in embarrassment, had to completely restructure the budget. Several ongoing contracts were canceled, and the community ended up saving thousands of dollars while actually improving the legitimate maintenance of common areas. My attorney told me later that my case had become something of a teaching example in his firm. He said most property disputes drag on for months with unclear boundaries and competing surveys. But having everything documented so thoroughly from the beginning, plus the HOA's admission in writing, made it impossible for them to claim any legitimate authority. He also mentioned that the certified letter approach was particularly effective because it forced the HOA to respond quickly or lose credibility with their own insurance company. Apparently, insurance providers take a dim view of boards that ignore legal notices, and the HOA's coverage rates went up significantly the following year. The community newsletter, which had previously been filled with rule reminders and violation warnings, started including actual information about board meetings, budget discussions, and upcoming maintenance projects. The new board even started publishing meeting minutes online so residents could see exactly how decisions were being made. I have to admit, there were times during those first few months when I wondered if I had opened a can of worms. The constant stream of neighbors asking for advice, the ongoing drama at board meetings, and the general upheaval in the community was exhausting. But then I would remember standing in my driveway that Saturday morning, looking at that yellow line painted across my property, feeling that mix of shock and anger at the sheer audacity. The former president had counted on people being too intimidated, too busy, or too conflict-averse to challenge her authority. She had built her power on the assumption that homeowners would just comply rather than fight. The truth is, most of the rules she had been enforcing weren't even real HOA regulations. They were her personal preferences dressed up as community standards. When people started asking for written documentation of the rules they were supposed to follow, half of them disappeared. The other half turned out to be so vaguely worded that they were essentially unenforceable. Rules like maintain attractive landscaping or keep properties in good condition are so subjective that they can mean whatever the person in charge wants them to mean. The new board spent months going through the actual HOA covenant documents and creating a clear, specific list of enforceable rules. They eliminated the subjective ones and focused on legitimate issues like property maintenance, parking, and noise ordinances. The result was a community that felt more relaxed while actually being better maintained. My woodworking hobby became something of a neighborhood attraction during this period. People would stop by to see whatever project I was working on, and it became a natural opportunity to chat about community issues. I built a picnic table for the family next door, helped another neighbor with some shelving, and even started teaching basic woodworking to a few kids in the area. The extra driveway space that had caused all the trouble in the first place turned out to be perfect for these impromptu workshops. It was ironic that the very thing the former president had tried to take away became the center of positive community activity. One afternoon, while I was sanding a cabinet door in my driveway, the mail carrier stopped to chat. She had been delivering mail to our neighborhood for 8 years and told me she had noticed a real change in the community atmosphere. People were friendlier, more likely to wave or stop for conversations. The tension that had characterized the area for years seemed to have lifted. She also mentioned that she had delivered more certified mail to our HOA office in 6 months than she had in the previous 3 years combined. Apparently, the ripple effect of residents standing up for their rights had spread well beyond property boundary issues. Even now, 2 years later, people still bring up the driveway incident when introducing me to new neighbors. I've become known as the guy who took on the HOA and won, which is both flattering and slightly embarrassing. I didn't set out to become a neighborhood activist, I just wanted to protect my property rights. But I'm proud of what happened as a result. Our community's a better place to live because residents learn they don't have to accept arbitrary authority. The current board operates with transparency and accountability that was missing for years. And most importantly, people feel comfortable in their own homes without constantly worrying about minor rule violations. The former president's house sold about 18 months after the incident. I heard through neighborhood chatter that she and her husband moved to a smaller community where she could have a fresh start. I genuinely hope she learned something from the experience and found a healthier way to contribute to her new neighborhood. As for my driveway, it remains my favorite part of the property. Every time I pull into it, I'm reminded that standing up for yourself, done the right way with proper documentation and legal support, can make a real difference. Not just for you, but for everyone around you who might be facing similar challenges. The yellow line is long gone, but the lesson remains. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, preparation, and a willingness to hold people accountable for their actions. And sometimes the best way to teach someone about boundaries is to show them exactly where the lines are drawn. The next one is a malicious compliance story. On Sundays, my family typically goes to church in town about 45 minutes away from where we live. I'm an atheist myself, but with 4 children, I opt to be around to help my wife out so she isn't overwhelmed. And I'll admit this church is pretty special. A decent community that has a meal every week, something rare from what I've seen. Families or groups take turns doing the meal for everyone each week. It's nice to sit down and talk to people after the service over an actual meal instead of just leaving or having a coffee and a sugar cookie, and then leaving. Once it seems like things are mostly under control, my children are settled or in the playroom or whatever, when I've had enough of the service, I'll typically go for a walk, usually ending in the kitchen and dining area, where the coffee and sugar cookies from the previous service are located. Now, having been to this church for a while, there's a peculiar thing I've noticed both at the after-service meals and a number of the more formal meals. Very often, there are no pitchers of water to be found anywhere. Honestly, it's really weird. At some point, I don't know exactly when, I had had enough of visiting the kitchen sink to get water in my glass, or asking someone for water, that I ended up using this walk time to just put out the pitchers myself while the service is going on. I'll fill up about 5 pitchers of water, and also put out the glasses, bowls, plates, cutlery, and coffee cups. No, I don't want to be a volunteer, and I'm not committing to anything. I'm not signing anything, leave me alone. I do this whenever I'm there at this point, and just make it part of my routine, and I'm quite happy with it. So a number of weeks ago, I was at home with my wife, and we were discussing what was in our kitchen cupboards and wanting to make more room as things were a little tight. Attention gravitated to our teacups. We both readily agreed that we had too many of them and could do away with some. We did not agree on which ones to do away with. My wife wanted to get rid of certain ones I liked that didn't match or were ugly or whatever, and said that we can probably just donate them somewhere instead of throwing them out. I paused, thought about it, didn't argue. Okay, let's donate them, all the ones you don't like. As it happens, since I'm the guy who is putting out all the meal items, like teacups, I knew that the church had somewhat of a shortage of teacups and coffee cups that usually forced us to use a backup of paper cups to cover the need. Also, most of the cups there were too small. So one week when we were going to church, I quietly packed the box of teacups into our van. When my routine resumed as usual in the kitchen, I took out our teacups and placed them with the church's teacups. But not just that, I made sure ours were at the front of the group of cups, where they are easy to see every week. I have not mentioned to anyone where the cups came from. My wife hasn't either. We're still married. The next one is an entitled people story. I'm not sure if this is where this belongs, but I figured it fits multiple categories and I'm just trying to share my story. Ex-in-laws from hell. For context, I have been no contact with these people for almost 2 years now. But prior to the NC, I knew them for almost 15 years. So there is a lot of history and this is just the one story that was the final straw. I will do my best to remember, but I've blocked a lot of it out as it brings up bad memories and is triggering. I, 31 female, and my husband, also 31 male, have been together for almost 3 years now. He knows my whole story by this point, and the things I have gone through with my former in-laws. So I will be give a few examples of my crazy EX family from hell. When I was previously married to my ex-husband, who is no longer with us, I didn't see a lot of the gaslighting and manipulation that happened. Because we had gotten together very young and it was my only relationship ever at that point in my life. We had been together since high school. But after I was attacked and stabbed over 30 times by him, I was 22, and left with literal physical scars on my body. I saw the real them slowly come out. I believe now when I look back at that time, they already held resentment and blamed me for what happened. They tried on multiple instances to make me think my own family wanted nothing to do with me, that my family wanted to control my life, like how they were actively doing, and unfortunately I let it happen. They said that I should come live with them because they would help me get back on my feet and help with the children, all the while throwing little digs here and there to make me feel small and insignificant, and that I wasn't going to be able to be a good single mother and raise my children on my own. They would make feel like every decision I made was wrong or that it wouldn't work out. Insult my intelligence and all around make my self-esteem feel even worse than it already was. That because I had physical and emotional scars that no one would want me, because I was now damaged goods and used up because I also had kids. This was all in the first year after the attack. They would also drink and take meds as a form of therapy instead of just getting help for their own issues and grief. They tried to keep me isolated from ever even considering finding love or a new relationship after years of being by myself. Granted, I know I made my own mistakes with some potential relationships and didn't always pick the right ones after trying to mentally and emotionally recover from the attack, which I had loads of therapy to help work through everything. But while I was also working through my own issues, they were trying to get me to let my older children come live with them just a few years ago, This leads me into one of the first examples that really made me start to see them for who they were. I was living with them at this point in a separate house on their property. I had been working in a small town about 30 minutes away. I had my own car, job, and was starting to look for my own place. The kids were in school, so everything seemed to be going all right. I had even started to see my now husband, who, again, knew how my current living situation was and was very supportive of me getting out and on my own. He had met them once or twice by this point and already could see through the bull crap. While living with them, I had no privacy, even though I had my own space. When I locked the door, they would come in and go through my things, take food I had bought, and never tell me. If I confronted them at all, they would use the fact that I was able to stay there, even though I paid for my own things. They would act annoyed when I would go out, which by that point all I would do was go to work, and maybe the gym if I had time. I would also take the kids with me 90% of the time because they had a kids area, and annoyed if I was there. If they volunteered to watch the kids so they could spend time with them or give me a break, they would only want to take one of them. They are twins. Or if they took both, they would then act exasperated at the thought of having to watch both of them. So I quit letting them have the kids, and when I did, they began acting as if I was taking them away, as if the kids were theirs. As I started to look at houses nearby to still have help with the kids and keep a good relationship with their grandparents, ex-in-laws from hell, I would ask, "What do you think of this one?" Or "This one looks cute." I would get the underlying passive comments of, "That's nice, but are you sure that's what you should do? I would do this. We can't help you. If you get that one, you should get this one. Then we can help." Or other little comments here and there with promises to help that never came through unless I did it how they wanted or suggested because they knew better. So eventually I quit asking or even bringing it up, until I had to go sign for the house I picked, now Brining and my husband. They met him and initially liked him and supported my budding relationship, but once it started to get serious, they would throw little digs in again to try and sway me from continuing to see him, under the guise of trying to help me find the right guy that would accept me with my baggage, referring to my kids and my PTSD and trauma that her son caused. In the end, they didn't want me to find a new relationship and take my kids from them, which by this point, it had been over 6 years since her son attacked me. I wanted to maintain the best relationship I could because I thought I was being kind and they were still related to my children. My husband was great with my kids from the very beginning. He had and does treat them like they are his own, and I couldn't ask for anything better. But again, once we got serious, then things started to pop up with the ex-in-laws. Once my husband and I started living together in the house, we were still just dating at the time. The kids still saw their grandparents every now and then and would help me by picking them up from school if I had to work late or able to go to the gym, since the kids area was usually closed on the days I had to work late, which by that point too, ex-MEL had started to make excuses why she couldn't pick them up after saying she could, which started to affect my job. But even still, I didn't think anything of it until and tried to make it work until I got a knock on the door. I had a visit from someone no parent likes or wants to visit, but they had gotten a call to come check on the kids because there was an anonymous claim made about the kids, which I found out later on was their grandmother because of what was told to them was the same conversation I had with their grandmother the day before. For context, I have never hurt my children. Anyone who does or makes false claims needs to go to jail in their own right. The worker also spoke to the children, which they have to do. Nothing ever came from it and it was dismissed. Now, a couple months later, another knock at the door. The same worker came back. What a coincidence. The day after my children were picked up by their wonderful and helpful grandmother. Another anonymous call about the children with the same story. My husband and I knew right away who made the call and why, but of course, I was an emotional wreck. Anger, rage, panic, all thinking my children are going to be taken away. And also while having my kids tell me, well, Grandma said we could come live with her if we wanted. I knew it wasn't their fault, and they were just being told one thing and they still loved their grandparents, but I was in full-blown rage mode by this point, but did my best to remain calm. Thankfully, my husband was there to help me and keep myself together. Overall, I just felt betrayed. After we finished dealing with that whole debacle and headache, we completely cut them off because that was my final straw. My husband and I had worked things out with my family and learned some things about the ex-family that made everything connect, which made the fallout from the ex-bill also make sense, which is a whole other story. So after the accusations and claims made against me, I would not deal with that and refused to answer any phone calls or messages. They even tried to come to the house when we weren't there. Until one day, when I was pregnant with our baby, my husband, who was thankfully there, dealt with the situation. I'm not sure what was said, but we have not heard from them since. So at the end of the day, I learned, it doesn't matter how long someone is in your life and considered family, if they aren't good for you and don't add to your life in a positive way, then you don't need them. It took a lot of time and a good man to help me see what was happening, and without him in my life, I wouldn't be as happy as I am now. We have a new baby, great support system, and I have wonderful new in-laws that I never knew you could have. Anyway, thank you for watching.